Please give a warm welcome to my guests, Connie Egan, Jonathan Tonge and Freya McClements. I'm an Uri girl, and it's been really, really extraordinary watching the change happening in my native Northern Ireland. When I was growing up in a Catholic, constitutionally nationalist background, where your Irish identity was always to the forefront. And what's really, really been striking about the Good Friday Agreement is that what it's allowed people like me over the last 20 odd years or so is to acknowledge that other side of our identity that we were growing up. And as I wrote in The Guardian and elsewhere in recent years, it's given me the confidence to say that I'm Irish British in the same way as maybe somebody would say they're Irish American or Irish Italian. I'm Irish, I travel on an Irish passport. I see the possibility of a united Ireland in my lifetime, although I worry gravely about the conditions that give birth to it. It's an absolute pleasure to be having this discussion, particularly as a journalist from Northern Ireland. I often feel frustrated sometimes in the South that you don't know us well enough, you don't love us well enough, and often when people talk about things like Northern Ireland and the future, the constitutional question, they do so, I feel sometimes, without an understanding of who we are. So I'm delighted that you're all here today. We're going to be talking about that extraordinary surge that we saw. Was it, Freya, was it 5 elections in 6 years that we saw? But
there
we
were
saw
an awful lot.
An awful lot of elections, but we saw an extraordinary breakthrough. And for so long, we have talked about in Northern Ireland the famed middle ground and how it would come through and how it would break through. But certainly what we've seen with the Alliance Party doubling its seats in the last election was a real, real breakthrough. I know many of you were hoping to see Naomi Long here today. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here with us, but you are very, very lucky to have with us Connie Egan, elected only 3 years ago and at 27 is already being tipped as a possible future leader of the Alliance Party and potentially a First Alliance First Minister, who knows. So we're very, very welcome to Connie. Jonathan Tonge has carried out some of the most amazing polling. He knows us better than ourselves. And of course, Freya McClements, who is the Northern editor of the Irish Times. Jonathan, I might go to you first of all, just to maybe just explain what happened at the last election.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. If you invite me to Galway races again later in the month, I'll take up that one as well.
That's way above my pay grade.
Yeah. In terms of explaining Alliance's rise, it's in some ways it's been a long time coming, because if you go back to the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the annual Northern Ireland Life and Times survey that's undertaken by Queen's University and Ulster University, that showed then that although unionists at that time were the largest sector of Northern Ireland's population, there was a substantial, about a third of the population, even then, back then, nearly a quarter of a century ago, was saying they were neither unionist nor nationalist, and yet Alliance was only polling at around 7%. In fact, Alliance only averaged about 7% through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and deep into the 2000s. So in some ways, it's been a very, very dramatic rise of Alliance over the last few years. And the question is, well, why has that taken place? Well, it's partly because those neithers have grown in size. They are now the largest single category. People think about Northern Ireland as being this place that is unionist versus nationalist or nationalist versus unionist, but actually the largest single category of person there, elector, is the person ticking the box saying, I'm neither unionist nor nationalist. But, and it's a huge but, for so many years, they never showed up at the polls. You're much, much more likely, even now, to vote if you declare that you're a unionist or a nationalist. So elections were contests of true believers within Northern Ireland, and it was a problem for Alliance to have such appeal as to mobilise that big section of the population saying neither. And Alliance under Naomi Long has really turned all that round and is getting those neithers out to vote now in a big way. And the ceiling on Alliance's growth may not have been seen yet. If they can get more of those people who are still turned off by the binary, who still don't think it's worth voting, who are particularly prominent amongst young people, who are the most turned off by Northern Ireland's unionist versus nationalist binary. So that really explains why Alliance has grown in size. There are other factors as well. I know
I'm going to ask you to hold the discussion on the youth for a moment, because I just want to ask Freya McClements, this week we did not see the middle ground on display. To see effigies burning of Naomi Long, of other party leaders, Marilyn McDonald, Michelle O'Neill, and other male politicians, but there was a distinctly anti-feminist aspect to a lot of those hangings. To see phrases like KAT, which we all have known from younger, is kill all Taigs, you know, in any, if that were, I won't even name a religious tradition, but if that were any other religious tradition, there would, you know, that would have been front page news in British newspapers. It would have been front page news elsewhere, and yet we saw that on display, all in the name of culture. Despite that growing middle ground, when it comes to the elections, it's still binary. It's still a binary issue.
Yeah, and I think this shows, I think in some ways actually it shows how far we've come, but it also shows how far we still have to go. So when John talks about that sort of roughly 40% that define them as neither, and the difficulties of getting them out in the polls, and how well Alliance has done in this, and also recent elections in getting them out, that's an indication of how things are changing. But fundamentally, I mean, I think Northern Ireland in some aspects still remains a very deeply sectarian society, and sectarianism is really ingrained in it. And actually one of the things that I've been doing a lot of work on recently is just looking at that question and talking to experts about that in the North, about, you know, can we do something about this? You know, we are at the point where we need to decide 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, are we going to seriously tackle things like the hanging of effigies on bonfires? I mean, sectarian language that is, you know, is absolutely completely abhorrent.
Not exclusive to that community, yeah. It has to be acknowledged.
Yeah, absolutely, and this is on, I don't want to say all sides, because there are a lot of people for whom this it just would never cross their minds. But I mean, you do see examples of this in terms of both communities. But in terms of the point I sort of made initially about it shows how far we still have to go. You know, bear in mind that Northern Ireland is a society that is coming out of conflict. You know, we'll be 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement next year. So this is a work in progress. And when I talk about how far we've come, you know, I look back to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even before then. The 12th of July would have been absolutely chaotic. You would have been watching scenes on television of perspex screens and police in riot gear and petrol bombs and goodness knows what else. And that's not saying that what we have now is right, but we have come a long way. And actually the thing that I found, I did notice a difference this week in the level of condemnation. And there was really strong condemnation initially, and it was from all sides. I mean, people like Mervyn Gibson, the Grand Secretary of the Orange Order, was on Radio Ulster, I think it was yesterday or the day before, you know, condemning this outright, and he did the same about the
there was a slight caveat though,
Hall.
because he also said, but I understand why people, you know, would want to do that. I want to just come to Connie.
But it still shows progress, I think, that he's even doing that, you know.
Connie, what we know is that so many young people leave Northern Ireland. They often go to university outside of Northern Ireland. They don't come back. They don't want to come back. You are like such an antidote to that. You first got elected as a councillor, I think, at 24. She's just 27. It's interesting because your own heritage is a mixed marriage, which a couple of generations ago would have been quite controversial.
Yeah, I think that was. I think people definitely had opinions of it. I was brought up in North Down, which was obviously a constituency dominated by unionism at the time. And I think while I came from a mixed marriage, it's also the context I grew up in. I was brought up around that culture of bonfires, the 12th of July. I was brought up and I went to a school where the majority of religion was of one side of the community. The integrated education is a huge issue for me, and it's something which there just is not enough provision of in Northern Ireland.
More than 9 out of 10 school children in Northern Ireland are still educated in segregated schools.
Segregated schools. And it's something, again, to touch on a point Freya was saying, it's institutionalised in our society, sectarianism. And that's a huge issue. We divide our communities, we divide our children, and unfortunately we see that come to the fore, like this week where we saw such displays of hate, which are so wrong, and I think so disappointing for people like myself who really, I would count myself as part of the Good Friday Agreement generation. We were promised prosperity, we were promised peace, and we have made progress.
But what Lyra McKee, our late colleague Lyra McKee, still called the ceasefire, the suicide generation.
Yeah. And I think that was devastating, and I think for people in my generation and people who are politically active and young, I think that was particularly devastating. And I think the way we felt about it was that this wasn't supposed to happen to
So what
someone in our
motivated you
generation.
to go into politics?
I
And
would
why
say there's
Alliance? Why
okay.
Alliance?
There's a mix of things there. I think there's several different things. I was very frustrated. I was always really interested in politics. It was something I always had a great interest in. And I think for me, I just got so frustrated at my local area, my local MLAs. DUP were the largest party at the time when I started getting involved, and I really disagreed with a lot of the stances they were taking. I disagreed with them hugely on their social issues. And growing up in that unionist background, those were the people I looked to as leaders. Those were the people I looked to as politicians who were supposed to represent me. And I just were like, they're not representing me. Those people do not represent my views, and I don't want that. I was really impressed with my local Alliance team. We had Andrew Muir, who was, I think, the first openly gay mayor, which was, groundbreaking at the time, 10 years ago. That was a big deal. We had Stephen Farry, who's our MP now. He's very socially liberal. He voted in favour years ago, was one of the very few MLAs to vote in favour of reform for abortion, pushing equal marriage as well, were two issues I hugely cared about. So those, along with local issues in my own constituency, really motivated me to get involved. But we know on a side issue, it's hard to get women elected. It's hard to get them involved in politics. To get where I am today, it took a lot of huge support from the party, a lot of encouragement, and I'm so grateful for that, because we do need to take steps to get women into these positions.
Jonathan, you were speaking about the evolution of the Alliance Party, and certainly at the outset, at its inception, would it, because you cannot avoid the constitutional question in Northern Ireland, but it was sort of a happy to be in the Union party, and yet you see this major shift, particularly under the leadership of Naomi Long, who certainly within the context of Brexit was a remainer in terms of that affiliation with the European Union. Obviously they're attracting people who maybe want a kind of politics that isn't dictated by the constitutional question, but how have they evolved in the last couple of decades?
Well, they've evolved considerably because Alliance was a unionist party, small u unionist, and not wanting to be defined by the constitutional question, but its literature, if you look at the election literature that we've been ploughing through for the project, it makes no secret that Alliance stated that they believed that the best constitutional arrangement was Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. You simply wouldn't see that on Alliance literature these days. They're constitutionally neutral, and a majority of Alliance members even believe that there will be a united Ireland. That's not to say that a majority of Alliance members necessarily support a united Ireland yet. But when we did a membership survey 20 years ago, a long time ago, of Alliance, only 10% of members said that they supported the united Ireland then. That has changed quite a lot in the meantime. But they refuse to be defined by the constitutional question. They argue that there's much more immediate things than a border poll. Also, I mean, if you go back to the Troubles, some Alliance candidates said that they unambiguously, for example, supported the British security forces. They didn't like the sectarian connotations associated with either of the main two unionist parties, but they were most certainly small u unionist. You wouldn't say that about Alliance now. One MLA that we interviewed for the project said one of the turning points, not the only one, because there's been others, obviously Brexit will be very important, was the flags dispute when Alliance offices got attacked in 2012. This supposedly small u unionist party was getting attacked by unionists and loyalists for having supported the SDLP and Sinn Féin's decision on Belfast City Council that the Union flag should not be permanently atop Belfast City Hall. It should only be flown on designated days. And Alliance, for several months, were getting their offices attacked. And that got a message across that actually this is no longer, insofar as it ever was, a unionist party. It's actually constitutionally neutral.
There will be lots of time for questions, by the way, so don't be shy.
Can I throw in something just on that, not to cut across you, but in terms of that sense of where Alliance has come from and how it has changed, and there was a moment that really summed it up for me during the election count following the May elections, and I was in the main count centre in the Titanic Centre in Belfast, and all the parties were there, and the election agents, and everybody was there, and the Alliance group, if you like, everybody sort of huddled round in chairs, and I mean, they were watching the results come in, and it was beyond your wildest dreams sort of thing. I mean, one of the MLAs said, you know, what's bigger than a tsunami? You know, how do we sum this up? I mean, people just couldn't believe it. But I spoke to this lovely lady called Moira Hendren, who her and her husband had been, elderly lady, her and her husband had been among the founders of the Alliance Party way back in, I think it was 1970 or 1971. The Alliance Party have been around for more than 50 years in Northern politics. And she told this story about her and her husband. They were going up to campaign in Fairhill in Ballymena. Now, for those of you who don't know Ballymena, you'll know Ballymena as sort of, you know, Ian Paisley territory, North Antrim, and it's now a shopping centre.
One of the best adverts anywhere in the north, the big shopping centre in the middle of
Big
Ballymena.
shopping centre in Ballymena.
Fairhill.
So Fairhill is now a shopping centre, but it was a cattle market then, and they were going up to campaign in this cattle market. And her father, she remembered her father sort of almost laughing at them and saying, well, look, you know, good luck to you, you know. And he says, you know, if you can make it in Ballymena, if you can make it in Fairhill, you'll make it anywhere. And they sort of came back, and nobody, you know, they'd been laughed out of it. And they won a seat in North Antrim. Patricia O'Lynn, first woman ever elected as an MLA in North Antrim, and first Alliance MLA in North Antrim. And for me, that was just a measure of how far Alliance. I mean, I didn't think they would win in North Antrim. I don't think the party did.
But Freya,
you know,
when we talk about this
remarkable.
amazing surge of the middle ground, it was a surge for the Alliance, but in doing so, they stole votes from other middle ground parties. They did so at the expense of the SDLP. Which would have been totally dominant in my constituency of Newry and Armagh when I was growing up, and have now been wiped out, in all but name, you know, in favour of Sinn Fein and the DUP. So, you know, that was what the kind of thing is. It was a surge for the middle ground, but at the expense of the middle ground, including, look, the Greens have been practically taken out of the equation.
Yeah, and this is the really interesting thing, that with a few exceptions like that in North Antrim, where they took the seat from the DUP, broadly Alliance's success has been at the expense of those other kind of moderate middle ground parties. I mean, somebody in the SDLP texted me during the week, sort of rather annoyed about the title of the event. Actually said, you know, there was middle ground before the Alliance came along and did very well.
And that is true.
That is true. I mean, and what we're talking about here when we talk about middle ground, it's really about parties like Alliance and like the Greens that don't designate themselves as nationalist or unionist in the Assembly. And what was really noticeable in the most recent election was that consolidation around Alliance. I mean, the Greens had 2 MLAs, they now have none. The SDLP went down, I think they lost 3 or 4 seats. I mean, they were the party that suffered most, really, in the election. So what we've seen is kind of a realigning almost of that middle ground around Alliance. And I think that's down to a couple of things. I think it's down to the fact that people now see Alliance as a successful party, no disrespect, but a party that will win elections. And I would expect that at the next election, whenever that is, I think Alliance will do even better, I think, because you start to get a momentum building up. And I think it also is something about the shifting in Northern Ireland society. And once you make, I mean, we were talking about sectarianism earlier, once you make that decision in your head that you're going to put your number 1 vote and your number 2 vote or whatever for a party that doesn't define itself primarily by the constitutional question, but by other things. I think once you've gone there, I think you don't go back.
So do we now, Connie Egan, have, because obviously the Good Friday Agreement, that system of mandatory coalition was essentially a 2-block system. It was designed in that way, but we now arguably have 3 blocks of, you know, the orange, the green and the yellow, you know, kind of in the middle. And how do you know, because of and it just, you know, for anyone who doesn't kind of know, I'm sure you all do, but that whole system of designating as other, how do you think the Alliance is going to be able to affect change when it's still within the vice grip of the binary system?
Well, I could talk for an hour on this. That needs changed. We definitely are seeing that there isn't 2 communities in Northern Ireland. There's lots of communities in Northern Ireland. I don't know if I love the term other, but it's what we've been given and it's what we're working with. After I was elected, we have to sign in on the roll in the chamber on the first day. Parties sign in as either unionist or nationalist. I refused to write either. I wrote down United Community. That represents me. That represents the vision I have for Northern Ireland. So I wrote down United community, because I believe that's what we have to be in Northern Ireland. We can only work on the basis of sharing and interdependence in society. It's the only way our politics will work, and thus the Assembly designated me as an other. The institutions are set up, as you said, in the Good Friday Agreement for 2 blocks. We see this in many ways. One thing that we think needs changed is cross-community voting. That's why we don't have an Assembly right now. After that election, after we signed in, we tried to vote for a Speaker of the Assembly. That would allow us to have had the Assembly up and running, would have allowed us to pass legislation, it would have allowed us to scrutinise departmental decisions, it would have allowed MLAs to get on with the job they were elected to do, which I'm now being prevented from doing. And 71% of MLAs present there voted in favour of a Speaker, but because of cross-community voting and because the DUP didn't vote for it, we don't have those institutions and we're not delivering for people. So that's a real issue and it needs changed.
But that is, Jonathan, a structural issue that would require an overhaul of the Good Friday Agreement. And is it not in the DUP and Sinn Féin's interest not to hear about that change that would allow that famed middle ground to come through?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the DUP and Sinn Féin, there's no particular incentives to change a system that has helped them so much. But I think if Alliance was to become the largest party in terms of seats, which is still quite a distance to travel, but it's not inconceivable anymore, then the pressure for reform would be overwhelming. I mean, you can change the rules of how, for example, you get a first and deputy first minister, or whether there should be communal designations, without tearing up the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, you know, in terms of how a first and deputy first minister is produced now, I mean, that was a change from the Good Friday Agreement. That was produced at St Andrews in 2006. And it really was a bit of a DUP Sinn Féin stitch-up. I think the DUP miscalculated because they assumed that they would be providing the First Minister in perpetuity. And now, as we know, Michelle O'Neill is First Minister elect for Sinn Féin. So
important census results due out this year.
Yeah, totally. So, but I mean, you've got this absurd position at the moment where, it's, yes, if Alliance had been the largest party, Naomi Long would have been First Minister, but then there was no chance almost of Alliance being finding the deputy first ministership because of the system. Whereas if you've got a nationalist party as providing the first minister, it has to be a unionist party providing the deputy first minister. That's nonsense when you've really got 3 minorities in Northern Ireland.
If I could come in there again, I don't think it is an overhaul of the Good Friday Agreement. The essence of
Good
the
luck
Good
trying to change
Friday,
it though in this current environment.
Well, I think we have changed the Good Friday Agreement. As John said there, St Andrews changed the Good Friday Agreement, how we designate, how we get a first deputy first minister. We had a private member's bill which changed structures of the Good Friday Agreement to allow official opposition. In New Decade, New Approach, for example, we changed the petition of concern, which was part of the Good Friday Agreement. From my perspective, I don't think the Good Friday Agreement envisaged that for nearly as long as the Assembly's been sitting, it's been collapsed. We had 3 years where Sinn Féin collapsed the executive, and now we've got, we're coming up in a few months, nearly a year, where the DUP have collapsed the executive. I don't think that's in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. It was the blueprint for peace and power sharing, and we don't have power sharing.
Yeah, and one thing, Freya McClements, I mean, you could argue that those who created the Good Friday Agreement, it was a master act of strategic planning. It's all around many corners of consent, of identity, of all those things. The one thing it did not concede was Britain breaking away from the European Union. And I had always felt that the first 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement would just be about the bedding down, the institution settling things. But obviously the main thing hasn't happened. Reconciliation we have in Northern Ireland, which I love and adore. We have, a peace that is marked by an absence of violence, but not peace in any. It's a negative peace. It is not a positive peace that is marked by true reconciliation. And I, like Connie, will have very, very strong feelings about the lack of integrated education after this time. But I sort of imagined in my mind that it would be a 50-year project, that the next generations would be dealing with it, and then Brexit comes in. And whether you like it or not, it has pushed identity to the core. And I wonder, Freya, how long can Alliance get away with avoiding the constitutional question when, because it's not wrong to identify as Irish nationalist, it's not wrong to identify as unionist or Protestant, and the big thing that it offers presently is saying you don't need to worry about that. But because of Brexit, there may come a point in time, and this island is actively discussing in many fora the possibility of United Ireland. How long can it get away without addressing the issue of identity? And eventually this party that began as soft unionist that is now arguably neutral or moderately warm in a united Ireland, at some point when that big question comes, what will happen to the Alliance Party?
Yeah, I'm going to nick a line of John's here, actually, which he's used in interviews with me. John is my go-to for many political comments of all shades. But you have this great line about the Alliance Party sort of getting accused almost of having splinters in their backside for sitting on the fence for so long on the constitutional question. And I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Brexit has been a hugely destabilising factor in the north, and I mean we still see that in regard to everything that's happened politically around the protocol, and it has put this question of a united Ireland or New Ireland or whatever the constitutional arrangements might be on this side. Shared Ireland, I mean, take your pick basically of words. It has, this conversation is happening, it's on the agenda, it's not going away. You can debate about timescales, and personally I tend to think it's probably longer rather than shorter, but this is where we are. So the argument goes, look, exactly as you said, Dearbhail, Alliance can't continue to sidestep this, and I've put this to Naomi Long on a number of occasions, and Naomi would say, of course everybody in the Alliance Party has a view on the constitutional question. It's just not our number one, because it's not the thing that matters most to us. So of course there are unionists and nationalists, and of course we are people who live in this place. We have views on this, but it's not kind of our number one motivation. Now, how sustainable, I mean, maybe Connie might come in this, but how sustainable that would be in the longer term, I just don't know, because presumably if this process goes down the line, at some stage there are going to be, I mean, we have the conversations already underway about what this kind of new constitutional arrangement might look like. I mean, what happens in the event of a border poll, for example, and I think that's very far away, not least
so let's ask Connie.
Yeah.
What happens?
I can. Oh, no problem. I mean, again, I'll be talking for a while here. So several points I'm happy to address. Brexit has definitely ignited the conversation. I think how the British government especially has handled arrangements with Northern Ireland under Brexit has definitely motivated people to think about their opinions when it comes to the constitutional question. But Brexit has also pushed people towards alliance. We were recently voted the most trusted party in the north on the protocol, for example. We're pragmatic around Brexit. We were very strong Remain. We campaigned to Remain, and we would support rejoining the EU. We think the more bridges we can build across Europe, across Ireland and the UK is important. We want to see that sharing. So we think the EU was a good thing for Northern Ireland, and I don't think it's worked out particularly brilliantly since we've left. I don't think things have been going very smoothly there. So it's definitely, I think that's a big attraction, especially in terms of alliance.
Scotland could actually be the biggest game changer on these islands.
We're seeing moves. Nicola Sturgeon's announced her plan. We could see, the breakup of the United Kingdom is looking a lot more realistic than it maybe ever did before. In terms of if a border poll is called, I think the lens people talk about United Ireland is still very much viewed as it's part of your identity, what way you would vote in a border poll. In the Alliance Party, we're driven by policies, we're driven by pragmatism, we're not really ideologically driven by the constitutional question. I don't feel like part of my identity is being in the UK.
Not to, that is an ideological position.
Yes, well, we've said, I think Naomi and Stephen, our party leader and deputy, have said, it's up to our party members, they decide our policies, they have input into it. What I would want to see before deciding on any referendum is plans in place. We had no plan for Brexit, and it went absolutely disastrously in my view. I don't think it's been going well at all. So I would want to see proposals from the British governments and proposals from the Irish governments.
I was going to say, good luck with the former.
As to what life would be like for my constituents under any constitutional change, because I think that's important. Well, first of all, Alliance would decide whether or not we do campaign, because ultimately it's not something that's going to be decided in the vote.
You couldn't sit on it. You really would have chips in your arse.
It would be up to our. We would. Well, we already get accused of that anyway. So it would be up to our party members.
I want to actually bring Jonathan in just on this, because I want to talk about, and Connie's just a wonderful example of it, but I wanted to talk about the one thing that actually could genuinely transform Northern Ireland politics, but which stays away, which is the young people in Northern Ireland. If they only realise their political power, because they are the ones, you will have much, much better detail on it, but they're the most agnostic on the constitutional questioned. If they come in and actually voted, they could just turn everything on its head for the whole island.
Yeah, just for an answer that one, it could just come back on alliance, because I don't think the leadership will be able to take a position saying we support Northern Ireland in the UK or we support a united Ireland, because I think the membership will be too divided on it these days. So I think it will be, it's almost like a conscience vote. I don't think that they would necessarily make a strong recommendation. That will hold the party together. Whereas if you go back generations ago, the Northern Ireland Labour Party, once they said we support Northern Ireland in the UK, they sort of lost their Catholic nationalist membership. So I don't think Alliance will take I think the interesting position on this will be Alliance voters, because at the moment, look at the poll of polls, 50% Northern Ireland in the UK, not a strong majority, barely a majority for Northern Ireland in the UK, but about 37-38% would support a united Ireland, again, average poll of polls, and then there's about 12-15% who say they don't know. A lot of them will be Alliance voters. They're the swing voters. If you were a Sinn Fein supporter, you'd be concentrating selling United Ireland to an Alliance voter, because they're the swing voters. We know Sinn Fein voters will vote in a referendum, in a border poll. We know how DUP voters will vote in a border poll. The people need to be targeted in the border poll are Alliance
and then
voters.
the big question is, will they take us if we vote that?
So yeah, but anyway, young people, young people.
That's the big question.
They're the least likely to vote on my side of the Irish Sea, 18 to 24-year-olds, but it's even more acute a problem on, if you look at in the UK as a whole, only a minority of 18 to 24-year-olds have voted at the last 6 general elections, so it's not a Northern Ireland only problem by any means. But young people, only 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds voted at the last Northern Ireland Westminster election. A lot of them are turned off by the binary. Most of them say they are neither unionist nor nationalist, okay? But they're turned off by politics, full stop. So how parties address that, I think, is a really, really difficult question. And youth membership of political parties, Alliance accepted, Alliance has done very well amongst young people in terms of recruiting, is negligible. So, the only place is the only place where you get young people into political parties in Northern Ireland is usually at university recruitment fairs. But you can count on the fingers of one hand almost working class young people going into political parties these days. That they virtually don't exist.
It's just, for me, it's such a strong voice that is not heard and that is not listened to. Before I just go to the floor, Freya, I just want to chat about, that notion of, we're here debating about Northern Ireland, and some people still think it's like somewhere out there. But one of the big questions is, particularly when I speak to my friends here, and a lot of them, and they say United Ireland, absolutely, completely, taxation start to go down a little bit. But then when you say to them things like, well, look, what does a shared Ireland look like? And would you be happy for the Union Jack to fly above the Oireachtas or other public buildings certain times a year? Would you be happy for 12th parades to be held in whatever? And then it's like, oh, no, not that United Ireland. And I'm going, oh, I see. And so I actually think, Freya, and it's something I've discussed with amongst others, Bertie Ahern, who would say that the biggest challenge actually around the United Ireland debate is how that conversation is handled this side of the border.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's really interesting. And one of the most illuminating things on this for me, and forgive me because I don't have the precise figures in front of me, but the Irish Times did a lot of polling around opinions on a United Ireland in south of the border. I think it was last November, December, and some of the questions that were asked about that, people were asked, so all people in the south, in the Republic of Ireland, were asked about things like how would they feel about having the 12th of July parades? How would you feel about the anthem being changed? How would you, or I think it was just looking at changing the anthem, how would you feel about a different flag? And the results were overwhelming, and it was something like between 70 and 80% said.
No. How do you feel about paying for your GP appointment?
Yeah,
what?
well, indeed, and that's what the people go.
And all sorts of, with the amount of work that would need to be done. I want to just see, are there any hands here? Because I'm conscious that we could take up the whole conversation, and we will get back. So put your hand up, and if you can, just let us know your name, and it's being recorded, so a wee bit of Davina McCall, do not swear, and all that stuff. This gentleman at the back. I think we have some roving mics here. So got this gentleman here. And do you know what? Can I just make a request? I used to be the legal editor, covered a lot of legal conferences. If we could try and keep them to questions and not really submissions, lawyers are terrible for it. But this gentleman here.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so you're all right there. John Boyle. I think there's an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that it looks, sadly, as if we're going to get a Sinn Fein government. And I think here we are being lulled into this belief that a united Ireland is an inevitability. If it is, I fear for alliance. I fear for the middle ground, because I fear that all the good work we've done is going to be put into jeopardy, as I think unionists revolt, and maybe more than revolt against it. Is that something that you, and I'll just quickly say one nice thing, keep going?
So can I just put that to you, Jonathan, because I think what John's question really relates to is the fundamental question of this. What if the future is not binary? And what, in fact, if the constitutional question stalls and is not addressed for another 25 years? What if there's a border poll and Northern Ireland says not yet, and obviously there would have to be two run on the same day, but is it conceivable actually that it will take another generation and both the British and Irish governments might have to wait this one out, that perhaps, as John says, it is not an inevitability?
Yeah, I don't think a border poll is an inevitability. I agree with what Freya said before. I think it's on the long finger. I mean, the only person who can call a border poll, of course, in the north is the Secretary of State. Well, the Secretary of State changes every 2 years anyway.
For bonus points, name the current ones. I'm only joking. I saw a hand down here. Did I? This gentleman here. And ladies, I want to see a few ladies' hands up to this gentleman here. My heart beats a bit flutters very fast when I hear that. Go on.
An Alliance Party conference 10 years before you were even born. And back then, when Cushnahan was the leader, there was very much, I think, a movement towards a soft constitutional nationalism position. You know, the gap wasn't that big, and there was a lot of dialogue, particularly with Garrett Fitzgerald and pluralism in that area. Now, I was involved in politics in the North for 15 years, and I've been in the bog side with petrol bombs going over my head, and I've been observing parades on the Gavahi Road and had bags of urine land on my head. What worries me, and you hit it in the beginning, is I don't see any change in relation to the North happening until there's integrated education. When you talk about the middle ground and the Alliance occupying that ground, and the party that I was very active in, the SDLP, a lot of that middle ground has been sucked up. The situation is that, in reality, the middle ground, as I see it, is a middle ground in every sense. It's actually a middle-class ground. Because if you look at the people that I come across that are active in youth in the North, and there's obviously not enough of them, there are people that come from middle-class backgrounds. If you go into working-class areas with young people, they're either not interested in politics, or if they are, they're extremely tribalistic.
Can I just then pick up that, just to go back to the panel, because there's two questions, one for Connie, one for Freya. Freya, you know, we still sort of jokingly use that pejorative term, kind of castle Catholics, but there are a lot of the middle class in Northern Ireland from various different political traditions who would be soft on the constitutional question as long as their quality of life is maintained. And I'm watching closely the surge in the passport applications to the Irish Passport Office and how that is being kind of democratised in the North. But there is a sense amongst, because obviously in Northern Ireland, what worries me is that the same socioeconomic conditions that were around or certainly gave birth to the Troubles constantly stalk Northern Ireland. But there is a sense that as long as the middle class is doing okay, they're not out agitating for change, are they?
Well, I think, you know, this is coming down to really fundamental sort of structural points, and we sort of touched on this in regard to education, but I mean, you know, again, back to the question of how do we tackle sectarianism, how do we change this, you know, how do we achieve things like integrated education? You know, at bottom, it's down to things like opportunities, it's down to socioeconomic problems, it's down to poverty, it's down to lack of jobs, you know, and until there's a focus on addressing all of that and change, you know, lack of education, you know, if you're, you know, a young Protestant working class boy growing up in parts of East Belfast, your chances of going to university, are sort of down here compared to somebody from, a middle, leafy South Belfast, and that's was the way in 1998, and it's still the way, and until we start
and
looking
it's
at some of those
fascinating. It's a totally different conversation,
things,
but
yeah, it's a whole
see
other
the,
debate. But
to see the
that's
change
what it
in
comes
who
down
is
to,
educated in universities in Northern Ireland, all that is huge. Connie Egan, let's go back to education, and we can't be too sniffy on this side of the border in jurisdiction where over 90% of schools are Catholic maintained. We can't just think that we don't have issues surrounding integrated education and diversity here, but certainly I know, Connie, when we were younger and educational research is born this side, I remember a game we used to play in school where we would taunt each other going, are you a cup or a plate? We didn't know what a cup or a plate meant but one was you a Catholic, one was you a Protestant. That is so ingrained in us from a very, very, very young age. But some of the issues that Freya mentioned in respect of education are structural, but some of them are institutional. There is, I am telling you, there would be a lot of parental opposition if you go and try and take that school. The Catholic Church has a huge role in maintaining that vice grip on integrated education in the North. It is one, I think, of the biggest tragedies 25 years on, that we are still socialised by 5 or 6 in pure terms of identity.
Absolutely. Before I became an MLA, my background was in educational research. I worked on legislation specifically to change some of that structural inequality and structural sectarianism that we see. Just to pick up on the point that the gentleman in the front row had said, if we have a United Ireland tomorrow, I don't think much would change in Northern Ireland. Just having United Ireland won't bring our people together. It won't bring down peace walls. It won't integrate our communities and have shared housing developments. And it won't integrate our schools. Only 7% of children...
Housing is equally as bad.
It is.
The
Housing
segregation
is
of housing
important.
in Northern Ireland is
And we
shocking.
see developments, one in South Belfast comes to mind, that was specifically built to be a shared housing development in an area that is already quite naturally mixed. That is specifically designed to bring communities together and to be a shared housing development, and there's been a lot of trouble and intimidation, sectarianism and attacks in those areas. So it's still a huge issue, but for me, I'm also the party's education spokesperson, so it's something that I take a particular interest in. Only 7% of children in the North go to an integrated school. The rest go to schools which are largely segregated along the lines of religion. It's not healthy for our children.
Despite a very fast-growing non-national or immigrant population in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
That is it's an extraordinary sort of vice grip, and actually you'll see a lot of commentary, particularly around Queen's University in Belfast, and long-standing allegations, Freya, that it's a cold house. But actually one of the things I feel, particularly for my generation, I'm now 45, was that a lot of the people of my generation, Protestants who went away to college, usually to Edinburgh, to the UK universities, they never came back.
Yeah,
They never came back.
And that still happens. There was research done by a Northern Ireland think tank, Pivotal, roughly about 6 months ago, and they surveyed those people, and the assumption has always been that people, and it tends to be primarily people from what we would see as sort of Protestant schools, state schools that have primarily Protestant attendance, that people went because there were more opportunities. And what they actually found was, yes, it was partly about opportunities, but it was also about these push factors, if you like, that young people didn't, that they were turned off by the sectarian nature of politics here. They didn't feel that there was a future for them here. That there were negative factors in Northern Ireland actually pushing them away. And again, I think that's one of those things. Until you start to take that on board and do something to change that, then Northern Ireland is just the poorer.
And yet, Jonathan,
really.
and of course Northern Ireland was actually in economic terms was as badly, if not worsely, affected by the original Celtic Tiger, by that collapse by virtue of a huge exposure to property that it had. But one of the big things that I had seen, because Northern Ireland always gets badly hit when things go bad on the socioeconomic front, but I saw Northern Ireland change before my eyes in the last 25 years, and I'm not just talking about Game of Thrones or Titanic. I was up recently in Newry and Mourne, my own homeland, and just driving through the Mournes and driving through those areas going, oh my God, this place is absolutely beautiful. The amount of people from the south who went to Northern Ireland during the pandemic, because the restrictions were different, as were the death rates. But just that, there was still, despite, there was a lot of positive change. And are we being too hard to expect that after that level of conflict, the sheer amounts of death and destruction in such an area that is a population smaller than most large UK cities. Is it, what are the positives that you have taken away from this time, and are we expecting too much too soon?
Yeah, it was never going to be a case of everyone living happily ever after once a deal was signed in 1998. And what really strikes me about Northern Ireland these days, comparing it to when I used to go during the Troubles, is just how much more cosmopolitan it is. You see far more people from ethnic minorities than you ever saw during the conflict. The other thing is economic progress. Yes, it's still heavily subsidised, Northern Ireland. We shouldn't run away from that. But if you actually look at the economic growth it's enjoyed, it's doing best of any part of the UK at the moment. Some people would say that's because the protocol actually works. Others would say that there are other reasons. But it's actually prospering, and it's been rebuilt and in a very successful way.
Belfast is unrecognisable, and one of the real dividends of the peace process was seen in lots of different ways, but something like over 50% of the hotel stock in Northern Ireland was built in the last 15 years.
Yeah.
Like an extraordinary dividend.
Yeah, and I suppose I would kind of end on a hopeful note with a wee
the cost of hotels in Belfast is another thing, but anyway.
Well, indeed, they've got a lot dearer than they used to be. But I mean, I was born in 1981, so the year of the hunger strike. So I remember, I was 17 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I remember kind of enough of the bad old days. And there are times I just look around and I think, things are so much better than they used to be, even in terms of opportunities. And the thing that really summed it up for me, the year after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, I was 18, and I grew up on the North Coast, and I was working in a hotel on the North Coast, and it was mainly, local people would come in for their Sunday carvery and on a Sunday and this kind of thing. But we had it was just the very beginning of kind of foreign tourists, and there were a few kind of intrepid Americans who would come from the Gulf and sort of come into this kind of war-torn country, and they always wanted to hear stories from us of sort of walking to school through hails of bullets, which never happened for most of us. But this was kind of the experience that they were looking for. And I was back this was near Portrush, and I was back in Portrush in 2019 when the British Open came to Portrush. And I was there the whole week, and there was so much positivity and people from around the world, people from the south who'd never come up north before. And it was remarkable. And I walked around the entire week going, I can't believe, this would have been unimaginable. And I remember standing in the stand at the 18th hole when Shane Lowry was coming up, and he was about, when he was going to win it for Ireland, and everything was just, you couldn't have been on more of a high. And I noticed that from the top of the stand, I could see my grandparents' house. And I remember thinking, where I'd spent so much of my childhood, I remember thinking, this would have been inconceivable, and this is how far we have come. The fact that we could have a major international tournament around the world in Northern Ireland, a place that you would have been mad to go to. We have come a huge way, and I think it's really important not to forget
a controversial
that.
question, Jonathan? I'm going to ask you on it because maybe the audience are too polite to ask it. But Sinn Fein has been in power with the DUP. It's a mandatory coalition. There is a sense sometimes down here that, the South is happy there's just horror about the prospect of Sinn Féin coming into leading or being in coalition and government. Is there a sense of sort of kind of contradiction saying, well, it's okay for you lot up there, but not down here? What have we learnt from Sinn Féin in government that I know it's nothing to do with your polls, but I just thought you're there. It's a Saturday morning. Why not? The sun is shining. What have we kind of learned? Because I was just particularly just picking up on John's question. So, what is there about the last 25 years that would be instructive for those who are obsessed by the prospect of a United Ireland and Sinn Féin in power in both jurisdictions?
Well, looking at other people's polls, I'd say probably get used to it, because I think going back to the gentleman's point up there, Sinn Féin is heading for government down here. Surely they're going to be very difficult to exclude unless Sinn Féin somehow implodes down here over the next couple of years. So Mary Lou McDonald could well be Taoiseach. Sinn Féin in the north is obviously, they have moderated their agenda massively. It's all, even at the recent Assembly election, Michelle O'Neill was not banging on about the constitutional question. She said it's not about a united Ireland, it's about the health service. Even though it could be thrown back at Sinn Féin, they contributed to the accusing the health service by walking out of stomach in 2017, but she made it much more about bread and butter issues rather than the constitutional
But it has
question.
forced every other political party and many others to actively discuss it, because that used to be a sort of a, Connie, it used to be a fringe issue discussed out here, kind of that only Sinn Fein were talking about, and yet here, as you were saying earlier, the lessons from Brexit is that it has to be discussed. How do you feel, I'm totally going outside of my agenda, but how do you feel about, you know, what I worry about is the exclusion, sometimes self-exclusion by unionists and members of the PUL community, but an absolute, and I suppose they don't want to get involved in a debate about a united Ireland because then they feel that they're already going on to that. How, and especially for a party like Alliance, which is offering a space where you're not dictated by the constitutional question, how do we include unionism who do not feel particularly loved by the union that they love? Let's be honest. You know, I think you have to have a lot of sympathy for those who want to remain in union that doesn't really, and we saw that through Lord Ash's polling and everything else, that there isn't a lot of love there. So how do we, in this conversation about our future, if it's not binary, whatever we call it, how do we make space for those who don't feel that they have a voice in that conversation?
There's a lot of conversations ongoing that Alliance, while we don't have a view on the constitutional question, have been keen to engage on, because the reality is, if we don't get involved now, we're going to be left behind. It's important we have those conversations. I would encourage unionism to engage with those. Something I think that's almost maybe surprised me a bit is how unionism don't actually engage, or they have such a bad relationship with the parties in government down south here. I think they'd find quite a lot in common, especially their opinions of Sinn Fein. I think there's work there. I think that was one thing that always baffled me. There's a lot of
behind-the-scenes conversations.
There is, yeah. I was on a course last year that was bringing together people from different political parties and different backgrounds, and it was about bringing elected representatives together and creating a space where we can engage with each other and understand. And I was talking to someone from the DUP, and he had recently been on a similar course down south, and he said, I can't believe it, they don't like Sinn Fein either down there. And he'd been engaging obviously with members of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and I was like, yeah, did you not know that? And he was like, I couldn't believe it, we got on great. And I was like, yeah, maybe if we see more of that kind of collaboration, I think that would be worthwhile. But I do think there are some unionists, maybe more commentators than elected reps, and activists who maybe are a bit more willing to engage, who realise that if they don't get involved with this conversation, they'll be left behind. Because if there is a future, if there is a United Ireland, it is important that unionist views are held, because, as I said earlier, United Ireland doesn't mean that problems such as division
there could be
are going
a
away.
devolved government in Northern Ireland, there could be representation in...
I would be very interested personally in having a conversation around what happens to Stormont and the devolved institutions in United Ireland.
And who pays that annual subvention? I have time for one or two. I'm going to go to you, but I'm going to go to this lady first because we haven't had too many female voices from the floor.
It's great to be here as somebody who grew up in Derry in the 60s and 70s and had the joy of walking the Peace Bridge so many times in Derry recently. And actually, I was just thinking back when you're talking about education. I grew up in Derry in a nationalist community, and I didn't even speak to a Protestant until I was in Liverpool University, and I was told there was a Protestant from the north upstairs, and I was thinking, how am I going to talk to this person anyway? So I do strongly believe in the education thing. But actually what Connie has just started talking about there, I'm delighted to hear that there was a conference that brought all these middle ground together. And I'm conscious also of, you know, so much of the media talks about on either side of the community or on both sides. They don't, both sides means there's two communities. There's in fact not two communities in Northern Ireland, you know? So start talking about the community of Northern Ireland and these fringes on the side, like what we saw on the 12th of July this year. And again, I was up in Derry before the elections. So many people of my age and people in their 50s were saying, I don't know how I'm going to vote. I don't know how I'm going to vote this time for the first time in my life. And they were from all sides and all persuasions, you know. But it's really been burning me here is, why doesn't this middle ground, grew up with John Hume and so much of John Hume, and so saddened that somebody like John Hume can't live forever, you know, with that brain.
But the SDLP is facing an existential crisis
Yeah.
as we speak and as we meet.
Yeah, but why can't all of those, like the SDLP, the Alliance and the middle ground, get together?
Jonathan Tonge in one big middle ground, the Alliance, the Greens, everything, and blast the two of them out.
Well, they can in certain things, but obviously the SDLP would support a united Ireland ultimately. It's not that, they don't obsess about it. Yeah. But I'm sure Connie would work with SDLP in the Assembly quite well, yeah.
I think people are often surprised when they kind of see things that journalists and commentators would see. Behind the scenes, we do get on well. I would say I have friends from all parties. I think you can have a bit of a joke in the canteen. You can have a bit of a good chat in the corridor. But unfortunately,
you still go into work every day and you have to designate one or the other.
I think what people see is Nolan radio show in the mornings where we're shouting at each other, and then scenes from the Assembly where we're getting very angry. But I think there are some positives. There is work being done. I'm happy to work
We have
with the
Liveline.
SDLP.
Northern Ireland has Nolan. They are cultural juggernauts in their own right. Finally, this gentleman here. Katrina Crowe will kill me if I get just out too late. Go.
Sorry, Dearbhail, as a Newry man living in Galway, welcome to Galway.
Thank you very, very much.
A couple of observations. I always believe that education is key, and I don't remember I know if you'd remember Seen Around 6 programme on BBC, and there was an incident that always struck with me. There was a Protestant kid and a Catholic kid, and each was asked what they thought of the other, and they both said, hate him. Next question was, why? And neither of them could answer that question. So education is key. But one of the things I want on the middle ground, whenever the Good Friday Agreement was brought in, the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists were the two dominant parties. Now, one wouldn't have said maybe that they were middle, but they were maybe conservative, Republican maybe with a small R and with a small U. And has the middle ground changed or shifted that much? Have those people
was that
moved?
Not, though, just a consequence of the peace process that the extremes were brought into the middle and the price was paid by it? Just speaking on those things, that many of us, it was captured so well in Dairy Girls, but many of us went through EMU, Education for Mutual Understanding, these programmes that they put us through in order to introduce us to Protestants in school from a very, very young age. One of the girls out of our school kissed a boy from the Newry High, so that was our great success of that. I remember watching that scene in Dairy Girls when they're just, Protestants put their toasters in the cupboards and, Catholics, and I just remember going, oh my God, that was us. You captured it so well. And I have to say, for Dairy Girls to have introduced to the British audience, probably in that final episode, they probably learnt more about the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process than they have in the last 25 years. And I have to say, they're just absolutely amazing. That is all we have time for. And the answer to the fundamental question, what is the future, is not binary. I don't know, but there we go. Take it away with you. I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you to the wonderful Katrina Crowe for bringing us all together, and we hope you have a great time and great to see you all in person. Take care.